The Tanya is one of the most important books in all of Judaism. It was written by the Alter Rebbe, the first Rebbe of the Chabad Lubavitch movement in the late 1700s. It took him about 20 years to write, and he finally finished it shortly after being released from prison under false charges of conspiring against the Russian government. It's a tremendously influential and important book in Judaism, and basically outlines most of the esoteric, Hasidic, and Kabbalistic beliefs that are held within it. It's 53 chapters, going over a few topics, which I'll outline like this. In fact, it says in the introduction of the book that he wrote it to contain all of the answers to all of the questions, religiously at least, but there's what to take away from it in a lot of subjects. And with that said, let's begin. So, Chapter 1. The Alter Rebbe starts with a series of questions, citing verses from all over the Torah and Talmud in regards to a certain set of definitions of the words tzadik, a righteous person, rasha, a wicked person, and a beinoni, someone in between. Seemingly, none of the uses really make sense according to the definition. In some cases, it says that God made people like these terms, which implies a lack of free will. It also says to consider yourself as a wicked person, which would seemingly be unhelpful, and most confusingly, one of the greatest sages of all time, a main author of the Talmud, describes himself as a beinoni, the guy in between. So, the Alter Rebbe will define these concepts, but first he explains the nature of the Jewish soul, citing many Kabbalistic and Hasidic sources. Essentially, you actually have two souls. The first soul is the evil inclination, causing people to desire and pursue bad things. It's called the nefesh habahamis, the animal soul, and is comprised of Klipah, which is a concept that will be explained more later, but it basically means that it stems from God's concealment in this world. However, it is a higher level, called Klipas Nega, which means it has the possibility of being elevated to a higher and more godly level, much like almost everything else in this world. However, this soul is the source of man's desire to do the wrong thing, and that's soul number one. Now, besides for the animal wicked soul, there is a second soul, which is called the godly soul, or the nefesh ha'alikis, and this is one of the most famous lines from all of the Tanya, and that is that this other soul is a chelek elikai mimal mamish, a literal piece of God above. That is to say, that God took a portion of himself and blew it into you, specifically the idea of blowing the soul into a person, as he did by Adam, as blowing comes from within you, as opposed to, say, talking, which just uses the air already in your mouth. Also, he mentions that there are different gradations and variances and levels between souls in different people. Say, there's probably a difference between Moses and most people nowadays, but the main point is the same, which is that this soul, no matter your level, is sourced from God. Anyways, so this soul is a part of God himself and is objectively good. It's also the source for your desire to do good and serves as your connection to God, the strength of said connection being dependent on your actions. Within this godly soul, you have the 10 sephiros, which are the 10 godly faculties or attributes. These are all attributes of God, and being that your soul is a part of God, it, of course, also has these 10 sephiros. They are made of intellectual and emotional qualities, with aspects such as wisdom, understanding, knowledge, kindness, severity, unity, and so on. It is important to note that each of these attributes doesn't just refer to the literal definition of its name, but instead refers to a much broader, complex concept and is just referred to by a single word that implies it. For instance, chachma, wisdom, refers to the concept of the infinite, inexplicable first spark of knowledge, while it's still without form, just as it enters your mind. While bina, understanding, is the idea of when you give that initial form thought, contemplate on it, and fully define and grasp it as something which can be truly understood and explained. Now, it's only with these intellectual concepts that a person could start to form an emotional feeling of connection, which is the idea of das, knowledge, to be fully unified and attached with God, and form an emotional feeling based on this intellect of love and fear, or awe, towards God, which is a topic that will be discussed at length later on. The godly soul, and its 10 attributes of intellect and emotion, are enclosed, in a sense, in 3 aspects: thought, speech, and action, which are the 3 ways a person does basically anything, but here referring to being able to do the 613 commandments of the Torah, which of course require the use of your thought, speech, and action. Specifically, the intellectually derived emotion of love to perform all the positive commandments, of which there are 248, a positive commandment being to do something, which is generally followed through a sense of love, and the intellectually derived emotion of fear, or awe, to not violate the negative commandments, of which there are 365, negative being to not do something, which is generally followed through a sense of fear. The way that these emotions are derived from intellect will be explained later on. So, when you keep the Torah, which is an extremely high spiritual concept that is in this lower physical world in the form of knowledge and books, using these 3 aspects of your soul, you're essentially enclothing your soul in the Torah itself. And since the Torah is God, when you enclothe yourself in Torah through learning and following the commandments with your thoughts, speech, and actions, You're essentially enclothing yourself with and connecting to God himself. To explain this concept further, this notion that learning Torah encloses and connects you with God, you have to understand the concept of the word tefisa, to grasp. Basically, when a person entirely comprehends and grasps a concept, his mind and intellect essentially encompass the concept, and it becomes one with you. For instance, if there's a piece of logic or a philosophical concept that you spend some time meditating on and wrapping your brain around, when you finally understand it fully, it becomes a part of you and slots itself in as a part of your mind. So too with learning Torah, that when you fully understand and comprehend it, especially the complex, logical, back-and-forth rhetoric of the Mishnah and the Talmud, your mind grasps and becomes enveloped in this knowledge. And this logic and knowledge is the will and wisdom of God, as He created it. So if you fully comprehend and understand the Torah as you learn it, your mind is connecting with God. It's for this reason that there's such a special emphasis in Judaism on learning Torah above all other commandments. There's many reasons, but on top of all those, learning Torah is the way your mind and soul connect with God in the most literal sense. Now, all of this previously was with the godly soul and holiness. However, all that of course has its opposite, which is impurity, and the concept of Klipah, as mentioned earlier. Even within your own two souls, the godly soul has its 10 spheres of holiness, and the evil animal soul has its inverse of that, which is what all negative emotions, feelings, and thoughts are derived from, and God forbid, could potentially become action. Also, the notion of this Klipah impurity, the concealment of God in this world, actually extends into a lot more things than you'd think, not just the obvious sin, but also any mundane activity that isn't holy and directed towards God. Essentially, there's no in-between. There's either holiness and purity, or Klipah and impurity. And anything that's not a good deed, or an action which facilitates and is intended to facilitate a good deed, is sourced in Klipah. Now, God maintains and sustains all this Klipah and impurity, but He does so in a very offhanded, uncaring manner. It's because of all this that the world is called the world of Klipah, as the natural state of everything not objectively holy and spiritual is to have God's presence in it not felt or noticed. So, people that derive their strength or wealth from Klipah will always be more successful, physically at least, as that's just the natural order of this world for now. Also, there are two levels to this Klipah. The lowest level of pure objective impurity, called the Shalish Klipas Atameus, which is what everything that's so impure that it can never be elevated is comprised of. For instance, non-kosher food or vegetables, as they can't be elevated from their impure state with a blessing. The second form of Klipah is much more prevalent and common. It's called Klipas Noiga, and it comprises everything that isn't objectively impure or entirely holy, which is actually most things. The thing about this level of impurity is that it's not entirely impure. Noiga is Hebrew for shining. This is because, although most things in their default state are of impurity and Klipah, they contain within them the possibility of being elevated to holiness. For instance, imagine a steak. If it's gluttonously eaten because you enjoy the taste and it makes you happy, then it's being used in Klipah and impurity. However, if you say a blessing on it before and after, and it was slaughtered according to the Jewish rules of shechita, and say you're eating it to provide you with energy to learn more Torah, then you've elevated that steak to a level of holiness. And this concept can be done with almost anything in the world, as most things in the world can be used in or for a good deed. So most things in the world are naturally impure, but through your actions can be raised to a level of holiness. Your own animal wicked soul is made out of this klipas noiga, so it too can be used for good. Now, all of the previous discussion lends itself into the topic of the nature of hell in Judaism, although it's not actually called hell, rather Gehenna, and has many different stages and aspects. However, unlike in a lot of other religions, Judaism's hell isn't actually a punishment. In a sense, it could almost be described as a reward. It's simply that, before you go to heaven, most people are somewhat unclean from engaging in all of the impurities of this physical Klipah-filled world, or from engaging in sin and the like. So, before you're allowed into heaven, or Gan Eden as it's called, you simply have to be cleaned off for a period. If anything, it's more akin to a washing machine than anything else. However, as illustrated earlier, it's not just sin that has impurity in it. Even something as minute as wasting time with idle talk or behavior is engaging in Klipah, as that was time you could have spent learning Torah and doing important things. Obviously, if it's a job of some sort, or the education done prior for it, which allows one to earn a livelihood, it'd be entirely permissible. But elsewise, wasting time of any sort is of Klipah, and will make you spend some time having it removed from you after you pass, same as most other people. Okay, so all of that up to here was to explain the two souls, and some background. To summarize, you have one, the godly soul, which encourages you to do good, and the other, the animal soul of Klipah, which encourages you to do the opposite. Now, both dwell within the heart, the spiritual epicenter of emotion, which connects to the brain, the animal soul on the left side, and the godly soul on the right and within the mind. And naturally, as they're from opposing sources and having opposing desires, they are locked in a struggle with one another, as the example is given of two kings warring over control of a castle, in this case, your body and its actions. And this describes, as experienced by people constantly, the constant mental debate which tears at a person's mind between doing the right thing and the wrong thing. So, these two souls fight one another constantly, warring within you, and it's up to you, the one in control of your body and having free will, to decide which you listen to, whether the godly soul or the animal one. Now, finally, the Alter Rebbe gets back to his initial question, which he posed all the way back in chapter 1. Throughout the Torah and Talmud, it gives some strange definitions as to a righteous person, a wicked person, and the one in between. Particularly, to begin with, in regards to the righteous person, the tzadik, of which there are two types mentioned. The first is called a tzadik who is good to him, and the second, a tzadik who is bad to him. And now that he spent a while defining the two souls and their conflict between one another, he can explain these definitions. So, the definition of a tzaddik is somebody who simply has no animal soul. People like this are exceedingly rare and exceedingly holy. Think people like Moses or King David or similar. Basically something you have to be born like. This lack of an animal soul makes them have a complete lack of any desire to sin whatsoever and utterly detest the physical pleasures of this world. However, there are still two gradations of the tzaddik. The first, the tzaddik who has good to him, who has so completely defeated his animal soul that he has changed it to good permanently. The other, lower level, is the tzaddik who has bad to him, who has only completely nullified his animal soul but not changed it to good, which means there's still vestiges of it lingering within him. So not the highest possible level, but still incredibly impressive and holy. These are not levels the average person can really achieve. The goal for the average person will be explained soon enough. Fine, but what about wicked people? The definition of a wicked person is somebody who has ever sinned, although it is worth note that in Judaism, someone who does a full, proper repentance is not only entirely forgiven of his sins, they are actually rewritten into merits, assuming that wasn't his plan prior to sinning. So, assuming before that, there are two variations of the wicked person, similar to the righteous person. The wicked person who has good to him, and the wicked person who has bad to him. And of course, these two have the soul pairing that has been described up until now. One righteous godly soul, and one wicked animal soul, struggling back and forth between one another. And occasionally, unfortunately, messing up. The difference between the two is that the wicked person with bad to him is someone who is completely ruled by his animal soul. He sins over and over and regrets nothing and plans to do it again. It's unfortunate, but there are people like this. The other, the wicked person who has good to him, is somebody that occasionally sins and does the wrong thing, but feels bad when he does and tries to do better the next time. So he sins occasionally, so he's called a rasha, but he wants to do better and is called good. And this is a level that presumably describes basically everybody watching this video. Occasionally doing the wrong thing, often doing the right thing, and trying to improve constantly. However, what about the beinoni, the person in between? Beinoni's soul exactly resembles that of a rasha, meaning he has a wicked soul and a good soul, and has the exact same thoughts, challenges, and desires as everyone else. However, the way that he differs is in action, because a beinoni is literally perfect. In spite of everything, all his challenges and desires, he walks a perfect line throughout life, never swaying even a moment into sin, eliminating an improper thought the instant it begins to appear until the day that he dies, starting, of course, from when he was born, or more likely, from when he first properly repented for his sins. He only ever does good, never wrong, all without the advantage of a tzaddik's lack of an evil inclination. It's pretty impressive, but an immensely difficult level to achieve. This level, however, according to the Tanya, is the greatest level for every person to strive for, perfection and no less. This idea of a beinoni is explained even further, that the two souls in most bodies war between each other to gain influence, yet this beinoni has such a degree of self-control that by him they're more akin to magistrates or judges who he decides between, correctly, of course, with the help of God. However, in spite of all this, the animal soul still exists within him, unlike by a tzaddik, so he can never really let his guard down. This all answers some of the specific questions from back in chapter 1, such as, why should a person consider himself as if he's wicked? The answer being that even if you're a beinoni and perfect in action, you should still consider yourself as if you're wicked, as you still have this wicked soul within you despite your level of perfection. And the great Talmudic sage mentioned at the beginning, who considered himself a beinoni, as his actions were literally perfect, spending every waking moment of his day in prayer and study of Torah. Now, surprisingly enough, this level of a beinoni is attainable for every single person, and as mentioned before, is the level every single person should strive for. At any moment in your life, at any given instant, it's possible to become a beinoni, as it doesn't require you to detest sin and find physical pleasures revolting. Rather, that's a very natural thing for a beinoni and every person with an animal soul, which is basically every person, to have. Instead, it's a matter of whether you act on those wants and desires, and to become a beinoni, you simply choose to have self-control and not act on doing the wrong thing, and then repeat that constantly. Not every person can become a tzadik, but it's remarkably simple to become a beinoni. Not easy, definitely not. This is, after all, perfection you're striving for, but it's simple and attainable by every single person, whether through habit or otherwise. Now, in regards to the beinoni himself, there are two types referred to, one who serves God and one who does not. The difference between the two of them is in regards to effort. See, maintaining the status of a beinoni is incredibly difficult. You are battling a wicked soul within your mind constantly, and never for a moment during your entire life descend into any form of sin whatsoever. However, once you maintain this status quo, it's possible to simply let that be that, and live passively, never trying to push yourself at all. You simply remain where you are, satisfied. This is the level of not serving God. You may be doing nothing wrong, but you could be doing a lot more than that. However, the much greater level, referred to as one who serves God, is someone who wages constant war against his evil inclination, constantly pushing at it and always doing more than what he did before. This is because things go drastically up in value when it's more than what you've done before and what you're used to, meaning going outside of your comfort zone. Even if it's a little bit more than usual, that little bit more is worth tons. An example is given of a donkey driver whose normal route is a certain distance, but if you were to ask him to go even a mile further than normal, the charge will go up exponentially. So, hard work is always valued more. Okay, so the nature of a beinoni has been established, along with the importance and feasibility of every single person attaining this status. However, as mentioned, despite its simplicity to attain, it's definitely not easy. So, how does one go about reaching such a level? The best and most proper way, as mentioned much earlier, is to utilize your intellect and emotions to form within your godly soul a level of love and fear of God, which will allow you to do good from love and refrain from wickedness with fear. This, as mentioned, will be expounded upon at length later on, how to achieve these feelings in a true, practical manner. However, if you simply can't, there's an alternative of sorts, which is that your soul, being a highly spiritual and holy entity, is not exactly too comfortable in a low physical body in a low physical world. It desperately desires to reconnect with God naturally, even without any intent or effort on your part. That's just a natural law of your body, that your soul desperately desires a proper connection with God. And, as illustrated previously, the best way to connect with God is to intellectually enclothe yourself with Him by studying and grasping His Torah. So, it's with this natural ability that a person is able to desire to, and then successfully sustain their soul and connect to God. All of this can be used to explain a very famous quote from the Torah, Ki karei velecha hadavar me'od beficha uvavavcha la'asei, that this thing is very near to you, in your heart and in your mouth, that you may do it. Essentially, as explained, it's difficult to keep the Torah properly and fully, but possible, and definitely within the grasp of every single person. Your mind does, after all, direct and control your body and emotions, and if done towards the feeling of love and fear of God within you, it'll assist you in keeping the Torah and doing mitzvot, which is your whole purpose in this world. This is all unlike wicked, lower people, whose emotions and hearts control their body, pursuing what their heart desires, disregarding logic and thought. It's only once they do repent and cast off the Klipah that they were embroiled in that they can have control over themselves, putting their mind over their heart and directing it towards good. Okay, but what about this notion of love and fear of God that keeps being brought up? To begin with, there's a general concept to understand, which is very important, and that is of the inherited love and fear in every Jewish person. Basically, the concept is that because the ancestors of all Jewish people, the three patriarchs, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, were so profoundly loyal and subservient to God, they merited to have an inheritance passed down to every single Jewish person, engraved into their soul, metaphorically speaking, by default, to have a profound feeling of love and fear of God hidden deep within you. So, if you're Jewish, you inherited from your biblical ancestors these emotions automatically, although, like I said, it's hidden deep within you. Not only that, but in your godly soul, the first intellectual sphera of chachma, wisdom, which as mentioned is the spark of infinite inexplicable knowledge that sparks into your mind, higher than an explanation with words. This gives every single Jewish person an innate and an inherent belief in God, the belief in God being, of course, a very inexplicable, infinite concept. So, buried deep within every single Jewish person, generally and sometimes throughout one's entire life, going unfelt, are the complete belief and love and fear of God. These only come out during moments of high tension and pressure, which is how you see throughout all of Jewish history people completely unconnected to their Jewish religion, heritage, or customs suddenly refusing to give up their Jewish religion and convert. For instance, in the Roman Empire, the Spanish Inquisition, the Crusades, and in many cases, even in modern times, where people tend to cling to their Judaism more when threatened because of it. An example is given in regards to the soul of a candle. In fact, the soul is very often compared to a flame or similar, and like a candle's flame constantly seeks to rise and stretch and flicker upward, so too does your soul desire to be with God. And since severe sins will disconnect you and push you away from God, sins such as worshipping an idol or some other false god, if someone tries to force that on you through forced conversion or similar, your soul naturally is so profoundly undesiring of being disconnected from God, it'll resist to the best of its abilities. Hence, you can have practical cases of people giving up their lives rather than convert, people who, up until that moment, were entirely uninterested and unconnected from Judaism, as illustrated a minute ago. Okay, so after explaining the concept of the Jewish soul's innate love and fear of God, there's another concept expounded upon, which is in regards to the creation and existence of the world and God's oneness. The world was created from nothing. God spoke the world into being, not creating it out of other objects or energies. He simply made it exist out of nowhere. Yesh me'ayin, something from nothing, as it's called. So, the universe is of nothing, which means that the natural default state, so to speak, of the universe is nothingness. So, it's only because of God that the universe was created, and it's only because of God that the universe continues to exist. He basically constantly is recreating the universe every instant, as its natural state is to default back to nothingness. And this is the concept of yesh me'ayin, that the world was created by God through speech and maintained in a constant state of recreation until now, which is unlike a person who, after he creates something out of other things, it maintains its reality after he leaves and walks away. Not so by the world. All of this means that God is basically just the only thing that has a true existence, as everything else is being constantly maintained through him, which isn't really a true existence of itself. Hence, God is one and unchanged in every possible sense. Obviously, this is all incomparable to a person. When a person speaks, his words leave him as sounds with meaning and definition. God's speech is very different. It's not even speech, it's just called that because it has the same concept of revelation of thoughts, and God's speech simply is. It and his thoughts are a part of him, so entirely. It's like the level of undefined thought in a person, the thoughts in your mind before they even form as words, which are entirely part of you, not isolated into something as small as words. So, when God speaks and creates, nothing for him changes whatsoever. It was all him to begin with, and this was how creation was created. However, since everything created by God is so entirely a part of him, if he created the world simply like this, everything would just be God. Nothing would have any individuality, and everything would just be nullified back into him, which is why he concealed himself from the world, to allow for individuality and free will and the ability to feel as if you exist irrespective of God, separate from him. And this was done through a series of contractions of his light, known as tzimtzumim, allowing only a tiny bit of light in the creation of this world. It is worth note, however, that this concealment is entirely one-sided, and God perceives the world as normal without these tzimtzumim. However, the comparison of God's creation used is still speech, which, as mentioned before, leaves a person when he does so. Now, God's creation, as you said, cannot truly leave God, as that would imply a separate existence, which is impossible, as everything is God. Nonetheless, it is still called speech, because there is a separation in a sense, which is from the creation's perspective. Due to the intensity of the tzimtzumim contractions of God's light, it creates the Klipah, which was spoken about earlier. And everything in the world is sustained by God. However, unlike everything else, Klipah is sustained from the so-called hinder part of God, which is the idea that God sustains it in an uncaring, unparticular manner, such as somebody who gives someone he doesn't like something by tossing it over his shoulder. And it's all maintained only because he wants to give people a choice in this world of their free will between good, which he happily and carefully maintains, and evil, which he maintains in a disgusted manner. And practically speaking, Klipah is the idea of haughtiness and heresy, using the fact that you don't feel God in this world due to the contractions of light to say worship false gods, or say that you created yourself, or a particularly severe heresy to say that there is no God at all. Now, as everything is God, God's will is what the mitzvahs are, and when a person keeps the mitzvahs, his body becomes a vehicle of sorts for God's will. For instance, with his hands as they give charity, or the mouth as it teaches Torah, or similar. The greatest example of this was the patriarchs, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, who did this, becoming veritable chariots, as the example is given for God's will, as their entire existence and every single one of their actions was solely to do as God desired of them. And as expressed earlier, the greatest form of God's will and wisdom is the Torah itself and its laws. Hence, the highest form of connection to God is by making your mind a vehicle for Him through studying His Torah. This brings you to a level of unity with God that's so complete that the only reason you aren't entirely subsumed into God and nullified is because of the tzimtzum contractions of light which conceal God in this world. Hence, learning Torah should definitely be done with a measure of awe and respect. And of course, everything has its opposite. Mitzvahs, the positive ones at least, and Torah connect you with God, and sin and the negative prohibitions, or violating them at least, disconnect you from God. Now, even Klipah, which is such a wicked, impure thing, goes according to God's will, unholy as they may be. God desires them to be as they are, and they follow. The only thing in all of creation that could stoop below even Klipah itself is man, when he actively goes against the will of his creator and commits a sin. Even if it's in something minor, you're still, in that moment, being worse than Klipah itself, because, as mentioned, even Klipah abides by the will of God. So, in the moment that you sin, at that time, you are more separated from God than Klipah, which receives its sustenance from the hinder part of God. And that's not even to speak of the misery your godly soul goes through, that after taking such a descent into this physical world, it now gets dragged through the mud and filth as you descend into Klipah. So, don't sin. And, as mentioned from the verse, this thing is very close to you. It's actually very feasible for every person to accomplish. It doesn't even matter what you've done until then, as any amount of sins can be repented for and entirely forgiven, assuming it's genuine and complete. It's why we ask God to forgive us 3 times a day in prayer. But doing as God wants definitely shouldn't be just done out of fear, whether of separation or punishment or otherwise. It's vitally important that it's done out of a sense of love, too, and to use the power of your inheritance, the ingrained, deep feeling of love and fear, which allows for self-sacrifice, to draw it out at times even without danger, and use it to fulfill the will of God. Okay, so now we get into some more practical ideas. To begin with, in regards to depression, not the clinical or chemical type, more in reference to in regards to religious matters, although that's not to say there isn't what to derive from it in practical everyday life. But with that said, if a person wants to go and conquer their animal soul and do all the above listed things, it's near impossible to do this with a lazy and sluggish manner, and this melancholical attitude generally stems from feelings of depression. So, what to do? Firstly, feelings of depression stemming from practical worldly matters such as financial struggles, health, family, or otherwise. There's not really an easy answer to this. What he says is that you should bear in mind that everything is from God, who does everything with good reason, so it should be accepted with gladness. Which, to be fair, is a lot easier than it sounds, and it's a bit of an oversimplification on my part, but the notion still is true and stands. For some people, the answer suffices, and for others not. That's just what it is. Okay, now how about a depression in regards to heavenly affairs? Things like guilt about your own wrongdoing or otherwise. To begin with, if sudden remembrances of your wrongdoings and sins are just popping up during random times in your head and making you feel bad, then you need to bear in mind that that's being sourced from the animal soul in an attempt to make you depressed further and sin even more. Being miserable and sad about your iniquities and religion doesn't help. It just ruins your day and makes you do even worse. So if that appears, just bear in mind that it's sourced from the evil inclination and no good can come out of it, so try to put it out of your mind if you can. Now, that's not to say you should just ignore that you've done something wrong. Instead, there's supposed to be a brief set time during your day to focus on your wrongdoings, regret them fully, make a commitment to do better, and then move on happily. If it's not during this time, then don't interact with that at all. Like I said, nothing good can come out of it. A second thing to be discussed is in regards to improper thoughts appearing in your mind. See, a true beinoni even controls the very thoughts in his head and keeps them clean, appropriate, and proper. However, while you can choose to not entertain thoughts after they appear, you can't really do anything about them showing up in the first place, and for a lot of people this can be very upsetting to have unwanted thoughts popping into their head. So firstly, if it's during ordinary mundane activities, you should definitely not be upset at all, because it's a pretty normal expected thing of people, and now you have the opportunity to fulfill a pretty significant commandment in the Torah, which is actually mentioned in the Shema, of to not follow after your heart and after your eyes, which means you get to fulfill the mitzvah of pushing away bad thoughts, which is a commandment even a tzadik can't do, as they don't have any bad thoughts. So, in a sense, you're all being sad that you're human and have improper thoughts is kind of haughty in a way, because you're saying that you're at the level of a tzadik, which you're not. And also, as mentioned before, God generally values much more the service that requires hard work, focus, and effort as opposed to others, so definitely not an issue and definitely not a reason to be saddened. And even if this is something you're never able to overcome fully your entire life, then that too is okay, because as is famously said, perhaps that is what he was created for, meaning to fight a battle his entire life, never fully being able to win, but constantly struggling and never giving up all his life, and that's just some people's lot. Okay, fine, but that was about improper thoughts appearing randomly throughout the day, but what about during prayer or learning, as there's actually an issue, right? Well, not really. Firstly, there's a mistaken notion that one mental disturbance during prayer just disregards the whole thing, throws it out, and makes it worthless, which is obviously not true in the slightest. Secondly, you should actually be happy, because whenever someone's losing in a fight, that's when they exert themselves more strenuously to try to resist against their winning opponent. So too, your animal soul, as it's losing tremendously during your prayer and learning, it gives particularly strong attacks to try and counteract your ensuing victory. So if you're getting unwanted thoughts during, say, your prayer, it's because your prayer is clearly being very effective and successful. As for the solution, don't try to kick the thoughts out or fight back or similar. You'll just end up thinking about it even more. You just ignore them, same as if a regular person tries to disturb your prayer. And eventually, with God's help, if need be, they'll give up and leave you alone. As for dealing with the animal soul, you're supposed to crush it, apparently, during the so-called war you're waging against it. And you do this in a healthy, proper, set manner by focusing on how terrible and low the soul is and how perhaps it's caused you to do a number of wrong things in the past, so you'll get disgusted by it and find it and its desires low and loathsome and do better in the future in regards to ignoring its opinions from then on. The key, though, is to do it in a proper, healthy, effective manner that doesn't just end up cycling you into doing worse, and it actually creates a lasting positive effect. It's even worth mentioning that not even your animal soul really is too interested in you doing bad. It's just that, as mentioned before, it's comprised of Klipah, which does as God desires, and as God desires it to tempt you to do wrong, it does as it's wanted. In addition, you should derive from all this to not be judgmental of other people, no matter the case. You don't know the circumstance or background of someone's situation, and it's most probably doesn't compare to yours. If you see someone doing something wrong, don't judge them, even if it's something you don't personally struggle with. Obviously, everyone has their own struggles, and some people find some things more difficult than others. In fact, some people's evil inclinations are just literally stronger, plain and simple, than yours. So don't get all haughty over other people. Stay humble. You don't know what other people are dealing with. And realistically, you're probably not too perfect yourself. Oh, and the fact that perhaps your personal animal soul is stronger than other people's doesn't give you an excuse. The only person you should be judgmental about is yourself. But yeah, as illustrated, you should focus on your own issues during a set proper time in a healthy, focused manner that actually results in improvements. And when you do, that's a fantastic thing. You're fixing things and reconnecting your soul to God. So don't be upset after focusing on your own personal wrongdoings, because through doing this, you're actually working on yourself to make things better. And they're even better than before, because as mentioned, your animal soul and body are made of Klipah, which means it has the possibility of being elevated. So you're not just fixing and reconnecting your godly soul, you're also elevating your animal soul and body to a much higher level, which should be something that makes you happy, actually. Okay, so now there's a bit of a tangent in regards to Ahavas Yisrael, which is loving your fellow Jewish people. Basically, as follows. Famously, it says in the Torah you're supposed to love your fellow as yourself, which is nice, but realistically speaking, how are you supposed to do that? Firstly, you have to realize that you are not your body. You are identified by your soul, and if anything, your body is just a physical vessel that carries it around. Truthfully, really, what you are is your godly soul, same as every other Jewish person, and every Jewish person has, and is, the same godly soul. So, from that lens, are you really so different from all of them, where it actually counts? Even further, all souls are not just the same, but were made by the same God, being the Father of all the souls. Hence, every soul and every Jewish person is literally your brother and sister, and the same as you. And yeah, they look different and have different personalities and looks and lives and upbringings and whatnot, but that's not really what defines a person. A person is defined by his soul, and by that regard, all Jewish people are brothers and sisters and should be treated and cared for as such. And besides for that, Ahavas Yisrael is such an important commandment in the Torah, in every sense. It's given paramount importance by God, and yeah, so be good to one another. Okay, tangent over, now back to the original topic, which is how to focus on how to love God, to be able to do the right thing. Now, you can't just tell someone to love something or someone, even if it is God. You need to either just feel it or have a reason to think of or focus on which will bring out that dormant feeling of love. For instance, most kids love their parents, but don't really feel that so much often. However, if they spent a period of time thinking about all the things their parents do for them and how hard they work on their behalf, it would bring out this feeling of love within them. So too with God. So to begin with, it helps to just think about this very notion of God, how he's infinite and all-powerful, has always existed and will always exist, and created the entire universe. Every sun, planet, and galaxy, and every atom, leaf, bug, bird, animal, and person, and not just created them, but recreates them constantly, and sustains and maintains them all, always. And he's that powerful, for lack of a better word, that infinite, that big, and yet he still desires this world and the people within it as his dwelling place, and gave them the Torah and the 613 commandments so we could make this world a better place ourselves, so he could go down into this world and be with us. It's a concept that if you think on for a period and really grasp, could lead to a feeling of profound actual love for God. Now, that's not to say you should ignore the opposite. It's important to have some level of sadness about the current state of affairs, such as that we are and have been in exile for the past few thousand years after our second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, and now we've been stuck in this low world with our low animal soul without any feeling of God in the world, which in fact should make you pretty sad. But you can feel two things at once, a degree of sadness due to the current state of affairs, but happiness because you can elevate this world and make things better, and bring God back down into this world as he desires with the coming of Mashiach. Also, in regards to a beinoni who could be spending his entire life fighting without ever being fully victorious, his work is in this regard, to draw down the godly presence, the Shekhinah as it's called, back into this world. In fact, there's an analogy given with the soul and the Shekhinah of course, a candle. The soul being the wick, and the Shekhinah the flame, and the way they connect is through the oil on the wick, which is representative of doing Torah and mitzvahs. So, doing mitzvahs allows the Shekhinah to descend back with us into this world. Torah and mitzvahs are necessary for this, as they're fully nullified before God and a part of him. And this is, broadly speaking, man's purpose in this world, to bring the Shekhinah back down with the coming of Mashiach by elevating yourself and the world around you, by learning Torah and doing mitzvahs. In fact, the whole of existence is for this purpose, as even every spiritual world and realm exists solely to facilitate this world, and God's light which sustains it, and the contractions of the light which also allow it to exist. So the purpose is all for the coming of Mashiach and the Shekhinah returning to this world. I say returning because there was a time when God fully descended into this world and everyone perceived God fully, like it will be by the time of Mashiach, which was by Mount Sinai and the giving of the Torah and all the miracles and spiritual ascendance associated with it. However, it all left and was pushed away by the sin of the golden calf, which is how it is until now, or at least until the world is made good enough that it can once again return. The actual drawing of the Shekhinah and godliness into this world happened through performing mitzvahs and the things you do them with, which was the early idea of Klipah, that nearly everything in the world can have mitzvahs done with them, and when you do, the object gets elevated. For instance, a cow can be elevated by turning it into parchment for a Torah scroll, or tefillin, or an esrog can be used on sukkahs for the mitzvah of shaking of an esrog, or money can be given to charity. All of these things elevate the objects through your action, and it has to be action. For instance, with prayer or learning Torah, you need to physically say the words, because you need to elevate your body. Just thinking the words isn't enough, as thinking is of your soul, and your godly soul is already perfect, so you have to use your mouth, which elevates it. Also, by elevating all of the Klipah, the Klipah which is subject to be changed to good, it in turn destroys utterly the Shalish Klipah, the level of Klipah which is so impure that it can never be made to good, which is how you fix both of these issues. So, in short, do mitzvahs to bring Mashiach. Also, charity is especially good with this, because money is made from your job, which is your labor and toil, and really from all of you and your soul. So, by elevating that through giving charity, you're elevating all of yourself in an extra powerful manner, and this is in addition to learning Torah and really everything else. And yeah, as mentioned, it needs to be done with physical action, not just thinking of the soul. However, that's not to say that when you pray you shouldn't think. The exact opposite, in fact. Thinking, focusing, and having the right intents as you pray is of paramount importance. In fact, a prayer given without thought or focus is compared to a body without a soul. Another comparison is that a prayer without thought and intent is called an animal prayer, as opposed to one with, which is a human prayer. There are 4 categories of things: inanimate objects, vegetation, animals, and humans, and the amount of godly light going into each one is incomparably greater than the previous. Humans obviously being much, much greater than animals, hence the analogy with prayer. If done with proper thought, it's incomparably higher and greater than without. In fact, angels are referred to as animals and are on a lower spiritual level than tzaddikim, who dwell in the spiritual world of Bria, which is the second highest world, as opposed to most angels who are in Yetzirah, the third world. Our world, the fourth and lowest, is Asiya. Tzaddikim are higher than angels because their service of God stems from intellect and love and fear, as opposed to angels who just do it with natural built-in love and fear without free will. As for regular people, their souls only enter the higher level of tzaddikim during holy spiritual days, Shabbos for instance. However, a person can also go to this level by, say, praying with actual intellectual fear and love. The highest spiritual world is the world of Atzilus, where only the souls of particular tzaddikim dwell, people like the patriarchs who are totally nullified to God. Our souls can only reach such a level during the period of bowing and Shemona Esrei in prayer. Bowing, of course, being the idea of nullifying yourself before God. The point of all this is to pray with thought and feeling as opposed to mindlessly. In addition to praying with or without feeling, there's also the idea of praying for the right reasons. The right reason to pray should basically be to connect to God. If you're praying solely because you want stuff or to make yourself look good or something else, then that's the wrong reason. And if done for the wrong reason, then the prayer doesn't ascend to any of the higher worlds at all. It stays in this low world and that's it. That is opposed to a prayer with the right intents, focus, and reasoning, which ascends to a level even higher than angels. In fact, love and fear are often compared to wings, which carry your prayer and deeds up to the highest spiritual world. So yeah, there's an incredible importance stressed about having the proper focus and intent while fulfilling a mitzvah, and of course a level of love and fear. But there are different levels. For instance, there's a lower level of fear, which is just fear of the issues of doing wrong, and then there's a higher fear, which is a fear of God himself, which, as mentioned, can only really be attained by focusing on and thinking about God. And there's love too, which obviously is just as necessary, and as mentioned previously, there's a part of every Jew inside of them that desires this unity and connection with God, and so you should bring this about through your love and fear. This level of fear is capable by every single person because of the inheritance of our ancestors. Also, back in those days, the person who brought it out was Moshe, through the Jewish people having a spiritual connection with him on his behalf, and his much stronger connection with God allowed everyone to have that strengthened, tangible, emotional connection with God. And this applies nowadays, as there's a Moshe, a Jewish spiritual leader, in every generation, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, for instance. Through this, it allows every person to have this connection with God with a level of love and fear. Now, this level of fear stemming from fear of sin is much lower, because it's something worldly and finite. This is opposed to the higher fear, fear of God and his greatness, which is fear of something infinite. The thing is, this higher level of fear can only be attained through performing Torah and mitzvahs, which allow for an understanding and relationship with God. So, to perform those mitzvahs in the first place, you need the lower basic level of fear, and afterwards you can have the higher level with the new level of understanding. In addition, to have the higher level of love, you first need to have that higher level of fear, which allows for some small semblance of knowledge of God. So, before everything else comes understanding through study. Although it does mention in some unique cases, some people can skip straight to the higher level of love, which is how rarely exceptionally wicked people do repentance out of seemingly nowhere. But yeah, that's through God's intervention to allow that rare case to happen, and for everyone else, it's knowledge first. The higher level of love is the soul's desire to be connected with God, which is accomplished through learning Torah and doing mitzvahs. This is nearly the highest level of love, as we'll soon see, but takes a lot more effort to achieve, as it requires, as mentioned, a lot of learning and understanding of the nature of God and your soul. However, if a person can truly feel this, they'll be able to do their deeds at a much more proper degree. Also, as previously stated, it's necessary to perform the Torah and mitzvahs also for the right reasons, to connect to God. The way a person can do this is by arousing the spiritual aspect within the 10 sephiros of Tiferes, unity or compassion, which allows a person to feel bad for their godly soul, in a sense, which has to descend into this low world and help reconnect it to God through doing the right things for the right reasons because of this feeling of compassion. Besides for all this, there is a way to reach the highest form of true love of God, which is attainable for every person, and this is based on the verse, Kamayim hapanim lapanim, ken lev ha'adam el ha'adam, which means that just as water causes a reflection of what appears opposite, so too does a person's heart reflect in others. And this is seen with love. Someone who loves someone else is often loved back. If someone loves you, you love them, etc. So, as is stated, God has a profound, immense love of every person, often compared to that of a marriage with the Jewish people. So, it's only natural that the love should be reflected within you, and that's all with the comparison of a person and another person who's roughly at the same level. How much more more so with God, who is infinitely greater than man and yet still loves him absolutely, it should only make sense that this love should be reciprocated within you. There is a famous concept in Judaism, based on a verse, that in every generation a person must regard himself as if he personally left Egypt, in reference to the biblical Exodus. What this means spiritually is the concept of the release of your spiritual, godly soul from your physical body as it connects to God through doing Torah mitzvahs. And this is the thought process a person should bear in mind while saying the daily prayer of the Shema, which is largely about the exodus from Egypt, to try and connect to God instead of wallowing in the pleasures and physicality of this low world, to try and connect to something far, far greater than yourself in the form of God. I've frequently referenced a concept called Seder Hishtalshalos, which is the chain-like descent of creation, for instance, the four worlds and the Tzimtzumim and whatnot. It's a very complex subject and refers sort of to the different spiritual realms and how they funnel and channel and contract God's light through the spiritual worlds. However, the things I've mentioned are really only towards the bottom of it all. Things get a lot more complicated and esoteric higher up before finally culminating in the Or Ein Sof at the very top, which is the concept of God being so infinite and incomprehensible that it's not able to be explained at all. But the ideas within this whole concept can be studied, as they comprise a lot of concepts in Kabbalah and whatnot. Point is, the more you study, the more you can attain a semblance of a concept of an understanding of God, and the more you do, the more you can understand how great God is, which allows for all of the above concepts of love and fear of God. Specifically, how basically all of the spiritual worlds and concepts, which are, as I've said, incredibly lengthy and complex, all exist solely for this world, which further expresses God's love and care for this world, which, as mentioned, one should reflect this love and love him back. And, as said, the more you understand this, the more your soul will desire to be with God, which will make you want to do even more mitzvahs through this feeling of love. And the ultimate version of this is God coming down into this world by elevating the world with the coming of Mashiach. Although, in truth, there really is no difference between God's presence between all the worlds, as at the highest possible level, God is entirely, absolutely infinite and is within everything equally. However, in regards to its perception, there's variations, with our world, of course, being the lowest, and as mentioned, our job is to elevate our world and bring the Shekhinah down into it. Particularly, the level of Shekhinah actually was also in the Kodesh HaKodashim, the holiest part of the Beis HaMikdash, where only the Kohen Gadol was allowed in on Yom Kippur, which is what is meant to be drawn across the entire world. Also, the Shekhinah is the level of which life and sustenance is drawn down into this world and revealed, and once again, this is all through the Torah, which is called the garment of the Shekhinah. There was a difference between the different levels of the Shekhinah between the different Beis HaMikdashes. For instance, in the first one, it dwelled within the Ten Commandments, which were held within the Aron. By the second temple, it dwelled to a lesser extent within the Kodesh HaKodashim, which was so holy that, once again, was only allowed to be entered by the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur after lengthy preparation. However, this high level actually dwells with a person to a lesser extent whenever he learns Torah, hence it should be done with a level of immense respect. However, it gets fully drawn down into this world through doing mitzvahs, which then elevates the object it's done with, particularly when done with the proper intent and emotion of a feeling of love and fear of God, which will eventually culminate in the coming of Mashiach, God willing. May it happen speedily in our days.